Welcome, everybody. My name is Martin Bunton. I am Interim Director at the Center for Global Studies. I'm filling in for Oliver Schmidtka, who is on a research leave this year. My great pleasure to welcome you all. I'm here in the CFGS boardroom with both Kayla and Jody, to whom I want to extend my thanks for all of their support at the center and for organizing the lecture. And we also have Dagmar and Jordan, two fellows from this year, joining us as well. So very dapper looking Jordan here as well. So, and before I introduce our speaker, Johannes, let me just say a few sort of introductory comments. And we'll start, of course, with a territorial acknowledgement, where we recognize that the center is situated on the let's do this properly, thanks. That we acknowledge and we respect the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Masonic peoples whose historic relationships with the land continue to this day. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before I introduce Johannes and turn it over to him. We ask that you please keep your microphone muted and your camera turned off until instructed to do otherwise when it comes to the question period. Do feel free to use the chat function on Zoom during the discussion, during the presentation, if you want to share thoughts with other participants. And then we will have a question period following the talk. Now, to ask a question, you could either type it into the chat and we will monitor that during the Q&A, or you can put your hand up or just make some kind of indication to me and I will call upon you. If you're comfortable at that point, then do please turn your monitor on. Of course, please, you must turn your audio on. Okay, and also just to note that this presentation is being recorded, as I'm sure you've already been informed. So great pleasure to be able to introduce Johannes Muller-Gomez today. Johannes has just arrived. He will be with us at the center for a few weeks as a visiting scholar, as part of a fellowship with the German Foundation for Canadian Studies. Johannes is a doctoral scholar both at the University de Montréal as well as at the University of Munich, and a member of the International Research Training Group referred to as a diversity, mediating difference in transcultural spaces. His research, on which he'll talk about today, centers on multi-level governance and comparative federalism, comparing the European Union with Germany and with Canada. And Johannes, let me turn it over to you there. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you for the warm welcome. Thank you also to Kayla and Jody for putting this event together and for welcoming me so greatly last week. My first time here at UWIC, my first time in Victoria. It's amazing to be here. Thank you so much. It's amazing to be back at the classroom, more or less, at least. I don't know whether Martin mentioned that I'm sitting next door. I'm at the center right now, but because of technical issues, we decided that I'm going to stay in my office so the mics don't get overwhelmed with several people sitting in one room. But it's great to be kind of back in the classroom. So right, yeah, I have the pleasure to talk to you today a bit about my PhD research. I haven't prepared a proper paper today, but my idea was to give you a general overview of what I'm doing in my PhD and to present the preliminary findings of two papers I'm currently working on in the course of my PhD project. And I'm, of course, very much looking forward to your comments, remarks, questions. It's all work in progress, so every kind of feedback is very much appreciated. I'm trying to share my screen. Oh, perfect. You should be seeing my screen right now, my presentation. Yeah, perfect. So what is my PhD project about? I'm working on the implementation and the fulfillment of international environmental commitments. And I'm particularly interested in multi-level systems and how multi-level structures, in particular federalism and decentralization, have an effect on the fulfillment of international environmental commitments. And a specific focus, and one paper I'm going to introduce you to today, is about the implementation of the Paris Agreement in Canada and the European Union. And my research in Canada is one of the reasons, or the main reason, why I'm here right now in BC. I'm still working on my interviews. I'm going to do some fieldwork here in Victoria. Next week, I've got already some meetings with people from the ministries. Thank you, also Jody, for helping me to get some to get access to people working here for the BC government. So as I mentioned, it's all work in progress. Yeah, that's one of my motivations of being here, to talk to people who are involved in climate policy making here in BC and in Canada, and who also can tell me something about implementation of the Paris Agreement and the role of the provinces here in Canada. So that's kind of my starting point of my thesis. These maps were produced by the Environmental Conventions Index Project, which is, if I'm not mistaken, based at Boston University. And that's actually kind of a very amazing project. What it did was to look at the national reports of all parties to the major environmental conventions that were produced in the last 20 years to find out how well the different environmental conventions are implemented in all member states and all parties to the conventions. Here you can see 4 maps which summarize the implementation rate of the Ramsar Convention, the CITES Convention, the Basel Convention, Stockholm Convention. And as you can see, we see kind of relevant differences. First, between the conventions, so the conventions are implemented to very different degrees in the member states, and also a variation between the parties and the states. So we see that there are member states to the conventions that implement the conventions quite well, and others that seem to have harder times regarding the implementation of the conventions they are party of. And well, the very basic aim of my PhD thesis is to contribute to the search for reasons that help us explain why some parties are more able or capable of implementing the conventions than other parties. And I hope, or no, I'm convinced that my research is also of political and social relevance. Well, I think we all agree that we're in the middle of a climate crisis, also crisis regarding biodiversity and other environmental issues. And we might also agree that it's a good thing that we have people out there. Some of us might also be part of this group of people that remind us that it's not only about making pledges and to promise that, yeah, we're going to save the world, we're going to limit climate change, we're going to save the environment. No, it's also about implementation. And we need to also take actions in order to really fulfill the pledges we have made at the international level. So what I'm talking about, or what is the variable I would like to explain in my PhD thesis, what I've been trying to say fulfillment of international commitments is kind of the abstract, the broad concept to use, which means basically, okay, we're going to try to fulfill what we promised at the international level. Then if we go one level down, we would be talking about compliance. So compliance would be the concrete achievement of the promise we made at the international level. So I follow here the definition by Young. Compliance can be said to occur when the actual behavior of a given subject conforms to prescribed behavior, and non-compliance or violation occurs when actual behavior departs significantly from prescribed behavior. So for instance, one classical example regarding environmental politics would be Germany pledged to reduce its carbon emissions by 20%, and it would comply with this commitment if it really achieves to reduce its carbon emissions by 20%. And the other concept which is of relevance here is implementation, which refers to the concrete actions taken by the states, by the parties to international conventions. Here I follow the definition by Simons. Implementation refers to the adoption of domestic rules and regulations that are meant to facilitate, but do not in themselves constitute compliance with international agreements. So if we stick to the same example, Germany promised we're going to reduce our emissions by 20%. And if Germany managed to do so, it would comply with its international commitment. If we talk about implementation, we would be looking at the concrete measures taken by the German government in order to achieve the target. Here we wouldn't necessarily talk about the accomplishment of the target, but rather on the measures taken and the actions taken within a state in order to at least attempt to fulfill the target that one promised to achieve. These concepts are very different to the question of effectiveness. That's something I'm not going to look at. Effectiveness would be rather answering whether the environmental regimes, the environmental treaties are really effective in terms of environmental protection. So does the Paris Agreement really lead to the mitigation of climate change, or doesn't really help at all regarding climate change? That's something I'm not going to look at. I'm really going to look at the pledges made by the member parties, by the parties members of the Paris Agreement or other conventions, and the measures they take to implement what they promise to do. So what has the literature told us so far regarding the implementation of conventions and the fulfillment of international commitments? This is a very, very basic summary of the literature. So we find 3 explanations of 3 key factors that help us explain why some parties fulfill their commitments better than others do. First is a question of willingness. So is the party actually willing to implement what it promised to do? For instance, is Justin Trudeau actually willing to implement the Paris Agreement, or was it only a symbolic move that he signed the Paris Agreement, but at the end he's not really interested in implementing it, and that explains why Canada is doing so badly regarding the implementation of the Paris Agreement. The second explanation would be capability. Is the party actually capable of implementing its pledges? That the question of capability concerns military, well, in the case of environmental politics, less military, but in other areas, military issues, financial, economic issues. The question of administration: is there a public administration in the country that is efficient, that has sufficient expertise regarding implementation? So it's about the quality of the political system and its institutions. That would be also a necessary condition for a state to be able to implement its international commitments. And the last explanation we find in literature is the question of enforcement. Do the international treaties foresee any enforcement procedures or sanctions in case that a country does not comply with its commitments? Well, as I mentioned before, I would like to focus on the question of multi-level structures and how multi-level structures affect the implementation of international conventions, international agreements. And multi-level structures would be one element of the capability concept, since they affect the capability of a political system to act, to pass legislation, and to adopt and implement political decisions. So far, we have already some literature on the effects of multi-level structures. Most of the literature that tries to take into account multi-level structures in their studies use them as a synonym to veto players. So the basic argument: the more players there are in a political system, the harder it gets for a system to implement an international agreement. And multi-level structures, federalism, decentralization, just increase the number of veto players. There's also other literature that just uses decentralization as a synonym to multi-level structures. So the more decentralized the system is, the harder times the system has regarding the implementation of international agreements. And last brand of the literature only looks at federalism and does not distinguish between different kinds of federalism, but simply considers federalism as a kind of dummy variable. So either system is federal or is not federal, and that might have an effect on the implementation of international agreements. And here I see several problems with this kind of approaches. So I hope I can convince you in the next 30 minutes or so that multi-level structures are far more than veto points, and that the veto point literature is not sufficient to actually understand the functioning and the effects of multi-level structures. Secondly, decentralization and federalism are two different concepts, as I will argue in 2 minutes. Federalism does not equal federalism. Every federal system is different. Just because in Canada, the implementation of the Paris Agreement does not go well, does not mean that in general federal systems produce bad results. The federal system of Canada works completely differently in comparison to the Belgian system, to the German system. And here we should distinguish more and look more into the systems, and also take into account the differences between the different federal systems. And last point with which I would agree in literature is that federalism is always considered a bad thing for implementation. Well, at least in most studies on implementation, federalism is always assumed to have a negative effect on the implementation of international agreements. And I hope to show you in a few minutes that's not always the case, and that if we distinguish between different federal structures and different elements of a federal system, we might also find some elements of a federal system that might actually have a positive effect on the implementation of international environmental agreements. So I've been mentioning multi-level systems several times without really telling you what I mean by that. I would say that multi-level structures is a multi-dimensional concept. I focus in my work on 3 dimensions of this concept. The first one is about the question of federalism. Is a system federal or not? And or to what extent is it federal? And what federal elements do we find in a political system? So that would be the first dimension of my concept of multi-level structures. The second dimension looks at the relationship between the central government and the regional government. So for instance, between the federal government of Canada and the provincial governments. What kind of relations do we find, and how, or to what extent is there cooperation between the levels of government? And the third dimension of multi-level structures concept is the question of decentralization, which basically asks which competences do we find at what level of government. But let me here zoom in and be a bit more concrete about these 3 concepts. So first of all, federalism, what do I mean by federalism? And the question, to what extent a system is federal? Well, a very basic, theoretical, abstract definition of federalism is that there's a balance of shared rule and self-rule, meaning we've got 2 levels of government at least, or even more. And we've got areas at which one level of government is autonomously, can autonomously take decisions, and we have other policy areas in which the other level of government can take autonomous decisions in that area. This translates into 3 key features of a federal system. If we want to find out whether a system is federal or not, we should ask ourselves, do the regions, do the provinces, do the states have sufficient autonomy from the federal level, or can the federal or the central level interfere to regional decision making? We find several cases in which there is a regional parliament, there are regional decision makers, but their decisions can be overruled by the central government. In that case, in such cases, I would say the system is not really federal. In the federal system, both levels of government should be autonomous from each other. Secondly, the question of accountability. If we've got a federal system, both levels of government should be accountable to their electorate, meaning we should have at both levels of government elected decision makers, elected parliaments, elected governments. If the regional level is governed by delegates from the central government, we wouldn't be talking about a federal system, but rather a decentralized system or deconcentrated system. And lastly, the regional level should also have policymaking power. The regions should have actual power to take political decisions and not only be the executive arm of the central government. And if these three criteria are fulfilled, we could consider a system to be federal. Otherwise, well, it would be less federal or not federal at all, depending on how many criteria are fulfilled. Based on these criteria, I propose this typology. I'm not going to go into detail here. But well, on the left, you find the three criteria I just proposed about the authority and the autonomy of each level of government, the kind of division of competences. So do the regions actually have policy-making power, or do they only implement decisions taken at the other level of government? And to what extent are both levels of government accountable to their electorate? Or is it only one level of government that is accountable and the other one depends from the level that is accountable to its electorate? Just to mention 2-3 examples, maybe. In the center, you find the type of polity which fulfills all criteria of being federal. This would be the typical federations, such as Canada, Germany, Belgium, Switzerland. They would fulfill all 3 criteria and would be then considered a fully fledged federation. The more we go to the right, the less criteria are fulfilled. The more we would be talking about a unitary state with decentralized competences. For instance, the UK, which is a unitary state, because it's the central government which has the authority over the constitution and the division of competences, but we still have regions such as Scotland with relevant competences and regional accountability. So it's a unitary state, but with federal features. And the more we go to the left, we move towards international organizations, but which also might have to some extent federal features, for instance, the European Union, where the member states still have the authority over the competences of the European Union, but both levels of government have policy-making power and are accountable to their electorate. That's why I use the term confederal federation, because the European Union is not a fully fledged federation in that sense that it has 2 levels of government which have the authority, the autonomous authority, and it should be in a federation, but it's an international organization with important features that bring it very close to a federation, or at least a federal system. And my expectation is regarding environmental policies that all these features and the question of where a political system belongs to which type of system has an effect on the political outcome and on the implementation of environmental policies and environmental agreements. So I've been talking about the question of federalism. How do I check whether a system is federal or not? So I just mentioned the 3 features I use to account for federal systems. Then I also take into account as a second dimension of multi-level structures, the question of intergovernmental cooperation and relations between the different levels of government within a multi-level system. So the basic question is, to what extent is there cooperation between levels of government? As well, for instance, Canada or the United States, I always mention it, the typical examples of federations in which the levels of government function quite independently. So there's almost no cooperation between the levels of government in comparison to other federations. Germany, the European Union would be the other extreme, would be located the other extreme, where there's strong cooperation and very regular and intense cooperation between the levels of government, with regular meetings between the governments of the federal level and the regional level, or as in Germany, by means of a second chamber of the parliament, in which the governments of the regional level are represented, which we don't have in Canada or in the US, for instance. And the last dimension of my multi-level structures concept is the question of decentralization. Here we are really talking about the quantity of competences at every level, at each level of government, how many and which competences are assigned to the regional level, and which and how many competences are assigned to the federal level or to the central level. And that, of course, will also expect this to also have an effect on the implementation of environmental agreements. So long story short, all this then led me to my general research question of my PhD project, which is as follows: how do multi-level structures affect the fulfillment of international environmental commitments? That's a very general question that I'd like to, or that I'm trying to answer by means of 3 papers. I'm doing a paper-based dissertation, so I have to write 3 papers. I've been working on 2 papers. The first one is on the effects of multi-level systems on the implementation of international environmental conventions. For this, I'm going to look at the data I showed you before in form of the maps and the different degrees to which countries manage to implement environmental conventions. In the second paper, I focus on the intergovernmental cooperation in federal systems. And here I'm going to look into the implementation of the Paris Agreement in the European Union and Canada. My third paper is still quite open. I have some ideas, which I'm going to briefly introduce at the end of my presentation. But here I haven't decided yet. I haven't managed to decide yet what I'm going to do here in more concrete terms. And in parallel to my PhD project, I'm working on another paper with a colleague from Utrecht University on the comparative turn in European Union studies, where we study the extent to which the European Union has been studied from a comparative perspective. And I mentioned this here because I'm going to refer 2 or 3 times during my presentation to this paper as well. So in my first paper, I try to find out why some parties to international environmental conventions implement the conventions better than others do. For this, I'm going to take into account, I'm going to include in my analysis the features I just mentioned, the different features and dimensions of multi-level structures. So I would expect that the question of regional autonomy will have an effect on the implementation of environmental agreements. So the question of, does a country that is member of a convention have regions that are autonomous, so that have decision-making power, and consequently also have to contribute to the implementation of an environmental agreement? To what extent do we have regions, powerful regions in the country, and to what extent does this affect the implementation process? The second variable I would look at is regional accountability. So does it make a difference whether a state has regional parliaments, regional decision makers, regional governments, which are accountable to their regional electorate? So here, as I would expect, that this has an effect on the implementation of international environmental agreements. Then the question of cross-level cooperation doesn't make a difference whether the federal government and the regional governments cooperate in general. Doesn't make a difference if there's a second chamber in a federal state in which by means of which the regional governments are part of the decision-making procedure. And the last point, doesn't matter how centralized or decentralized a system is regarding the implementation of environmental agreements. Since I'm looking at various conventions, I also have to include a variable taking into account the different kinds of conventions I'm looking at. To test this, the relevance of these variables, I run an ordinary least squares regression. I have data for 6 international environmental conventions. For the Ramsar Convention, which is on wetlands, the CITES Convention, which is on the trade of endangered species, and 4 more. In total, including all parties to these conventions, I have 683 cases. So far, unfortunately, I've only studied the Ramsar Convention, or I finished the coding for the Ramsar Convention. So my following findings are only based on the analysis of the Ramsar Convention. I still have to include the other conventions I still have to code the other conventions and include them in my data set. So everything which follows now is only based on my study of the Ramsar Convention on wetlands. So I'm going to go very quickly through my preliminary findings of my regression analysis. So first, my bivariate analysis, I find that indeed the regional accountability question has an effect on implementation. So the question or the situation in which a country has regional parliaments, regional decision makers that are accountable to the regional electorate apparently seems to have a positive effect on implementation. So for instance, cases like Belgium, Switzerland, in which we have federal systems where there are regions, where the regional parliaments are directly elected by the regions. In such cases, we seem to see better implementation of the Ramsar Convention in other cases. Here, as around a multivariate analysis, I'm not going to go into detail here, just to mention that the positive effect is constant in all models. Regional accountability really seems to matter regarding implementation of the Ramsar Convention. Is mitigated by other effects, by other factors, but that's something I'm not going to go into detail here. If you want, we can discuss this later on in the discussion part. So just to summarize really briefly the preliminary findings of my first paper, just going to have a look at the watch. Okay. So regional accountability. So again, the existence of regional parliaments, regional governments that are directly accountable to the regional electorate seem to have a positive effect on the implementation of the Ramsar Convention on wetlands. So against the general wisdom, which I mentioned before, that federal systems, federal features are always bad for implementation, does not seem true, doesn't seem to apply in the case of the Ramsar Convention. The federal feature of having regional parliaments that are directly elected by the regional electorate seem to have a positive effect on the implementation. And this would contradict the general wisdom that federal structures are always bad for implementation. These are the mitigating effects I mentioned 2 seconds ago, but I'm just going to skip this part for the moment. So the very basic idea of the first paper is to get a general overview. Does it matter whether the system is has multi-level structures or not? And again, it's a very preliminary finding, but it seems that some multi-level features, such as the question of accountability at the regional level, has an effect on the implementation of international conventions. But the idea was in this first paper to include all dimensions of multi-level structures in order to get a general overview and to identify general tendencies. So do they actually matter, multi-level structures? In my second paper, in which I studied implementation of the Paris Agreement in the European Union and Canada, I focus on the second dimension, on the question of intergovernmental relations and cross-level cooperation. Right, so yeah, so it's about cross-level cooperation, federal systems, and their effects on the implementation of environmental agreements. So I guess we are all aware of the Paris Agreement that was adopted in 2015 in Paris, and which is considered one of the major milestones in the global fight against climate change. And in, I think next week, we have the next climate summit in Glasgow, which also will serve to review the Paris Agreement and to look at the efforts and the actions that the states have taken so far to implement the Paris Agreement. So I think it's a good moment to have a look at what has been done in the last 6 years and to find out why some countries have harder times than others regarding the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Well, here we'll focus on federal systems. Since federal systems can be expected to have harder times than other political systems regarding implementation of the Paris Agreement. This particularly applies to federal systems in which the policy field in question, so in this case, environmental policy, energy policy, climate policy, belong to the competences of the regional level or are part of the shared competences which would then mean that the federal government would need the help of the sub-federal level, so of the Bundesländer, of the provinces, of the states, to contribute to the implementation of the agreement, and cannot do it all by itself. So Trudeau, for instance, needs the provinces to contribute to the implementation of the Paris Agreement in order to fulfill the targets Trudeau committed to. Second point, while federal systems have harder times implementing the Paris Agreement, emerges in cases in which we have regional entities with very diverging interests. This is, for instance, true again in Canada. Alberta has, of course, very different interests regarding energy and environmental policies than Quebec or British Columbia. And in these cases, for the federal government, it's kind of difficult to propose compromises that fit everyone's interests, and to find a way to bring everybody on board. Got a similar situation in the European Union. We've got Poland, for instance, which is of course very different energy interests than Sweden or France. And here as well, we need to find ways to bring everyone on board, and in order to develop a joint implementation strategy. So what has the literature told us so far? How do federal systems in which face these two kind of challenges, the fact that the policy field in question is part of the shared competences in which we see very diverging regional interests. So the basic condition I mentioned before is that the federal government has to be actually willing to implement the Paris Agreement. If the German government is not willing to implement the Paris Agreement, it won't be Germany won't implement the Paris Agreement, even if the Bundesländer are motivated to do so. The same in Canada. Justin Trudeau doesn't really want to implement the Paris Agreement. The ambition of BC or Quebec to have ambitious climate goals will not be sufficient for Canada to achieve its targets. And if the federal government is willing to implement the agreement it signed, the literature tells us that it should try to engage in intergovernmental cooperation, to go and meet with the provinces, with the Bundesländer, with the states, and by means of these negotiations, bargaining, and meetings, a learning procedure will kick in, and compromise solutions will be found. In the end, the federal government will be able to produce a joint cross-level implementation strategy together with the sub-federal level and manage to jointly implement the agreement. And that's actually what Trudeau did. When he came back from Paris 2015, 3 months afterwards, he met with the premiers of the provinces in Vancouver in March 2016, where they where they adopted the Vancouver Declaration, where everyone promised, we're going to do this together, we're going to fight climate change together and implement Canada's climate targets. Then the same year, December 2016, so 1 year after the adoption of the Paris Agreement, Canada and most of its provinces adopted the PanCanadian Framework on clean growth and climate change, again in order to jointly implement the Paris Agreement. So far so good, but then, if we have a closer look at the end, I think most of the literature agrees that the PanCanadian Framework on climate change has been a failure. Canada, or more specifically Trudeau and his government, have not managed to bring everyone on board. What has happened? Saskatchewan and Manitoba did not sign the PanCanadian Framework, so they're not part of this joint commitment of the federal government and the provincial governments to jointly implement the Paris Agreement. 2 years later, Alberta and Ontario, under the new governments, decided to withdraw from the PanCanadian Framework. And the same year, most of these provinces even constitutionally contested the measures taken by the federal government in order to implement the Paris Agreement, in particular the carbon tax adopted by the Trudeau government. So all started very well in Canada. Trudeau launched a process of intergovernmental cooperation, but at the end it didn't work out. The relevant provinces are not on board. Ontario is the largest province and Alberta is the most polluting province, are not part of this process anymore, which kind of, well, at least complicates the implementation of the Paris Agreement in Canada. So this is the argument I just introduced to you, which is so far dominant in the literature, that argues that intergovernmental cooperation during the implementation process helps to overcome differences within a federal system. Doesn't seem to work out always. So there have to be other conditions that help us explain why some federal systems do better than others, and conditions that, or other factors that condition this process of intergovernmental cooperation and that condition the success of such intergovernmental meetings regarding the implementation of environmental agreement. And one argument I would like to test in this paper is the following. Here you see Trudeau in Paris when he gave Canada's consent to the Paris Agreement, and on the right, Trudeau signing the Paris Agreement officially in New York. What I would like to highlight is the fact that Trudeau was all alone. It was the Trudeau government that negotiated the Paris Agreement. In the last minute decision, he invited provinces to join him to Paris, but in the end, it was the federal government that negotiated on Canada's behalf. And it was only the federal government that signed and ratified the Paris Agreement. The provinces were not involved. And that's the argument I would like to test. The very fact that the Canadian government unilaterally negotiated and signed the Paris Agreement might have an effect on the implementation process. And if it would have been the other way, or if Trudeau had involved the provinces during the negotiation of the Paris Agreement, we might be in another situation right now. So based on that, that's my research question for this paper. How does the involvement or non-involvement of the sub-federal level in international negotiations affect the fulfillment of international commitments? So regarding the Canadian case, does it matter whether provinces are involved or not in the negotiation of an international agreement already in an early stage, or does this not have an effect on the implementation process? So here I compare European Union to Canada. Why that? In comparison to Canada, the European Union has already adopted several measures that point to a general strategy for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. I'm not arguing that the European Union is doing enough in terms of climate change, but it is far closer to achieving its goals and the pledges made in the Paris Agreement in Canada. As in contrast to Canada, the European Union as a multinational organization is represented in the international negotiations not only by the European Commission and the Council of the European Union, but also by the then 28 member states. As a consequence, the European Union took a very cooperative approach during the negotiations. The 28 member states plus the institutions decided on a joint negotiation position beforehand, and then went together to Paris to jointly negotiate the Paris Agreement. And that's in harsh contrast to the Canadian case, where it was the federal government that went more or less all by itself to Paris and didn't essentially consult the provinces before making Canada's pledge in Paris. I don't know how the general tendency is here in BC. In Quebec, I have the impression that people are quite open to compare the European Union to other cases. In Europe, it's kind of still a no-go. So when I presented this paper half a year ago in a conference in Europe, everybody was like, "Yeah, you're crazy. How dare you compare the European Union to a state? The European Union is an international organization. It doesn't make sense." So here we disagree. So first of all, and these are some preliminary data from the paper I mentioned before, on which I'm working with Alex Hoppe from Utrecht University on the comparative turn in European Union studies. So here you can see the number of papers that have been published in the last 30 years, the papers that use a comparative approach, and that compare the European Union to other cases. So as you can see, the number of articles comparing the European Union has been increasing in the last 30 years. And what I find maybe more interesting is the fact that the European Union has always been compared more to states and not to other international organizations. Like in particular last year, we see far more, or in the last years, there are far more comparisons of the European Union to states instead of international organizations. When you have a closer look at states which are compared to the European Union, well, dominant case is, well, of course, the United States. But second place already, Canada is the country which is, after the States, most compared with the European Union. Since apparently more and more scholars realize that there are sufficient similarities between both systems, which makes them comparable. Here, last figure that shows the issues that are compared. And number one and number two is a green one. 21% of the papers that compare the European to other cases look at policy fields and public policy making. So we're not comparing, we also have many papers that compare the European to Canada because of the institutional structures, because of their multicultural and multinational nature. But we've got also a relevant amount of papers that look at how these political institutions produce policies. And it's also where I would be a part of, or would fit in with my paper. So how do these different political structures lead to different policies and affect public policies and the implementation thereof. And I think that environmental policies and climate policies are very a good example for why it's worth comparing Canada to the EU and not Germany or Austria or Belgium. Climate policy and environmental policies are shared competence in the EU. We've got an EU pledge, the commitment of Europe in the Paris Agreement is the European Union's commitment. There's no German, there's no French, no Swedish commitment in the Paris Agreement. So I would say that it wouldn't make sense to compare Canada to Germany or to another European federation because it's the European goal, the European target that has to be implemented. And the EU is also a party on its own right within the UNFCCC and also signed and ratified the Paris Agreement. So I think that climate policies are really a good example where it makes more sense to use the European Union as a case to compare with countries overseas than to look at the national member states of the European Union as a case of comparison. So I'm seeing that my time is already gone. I try to conclude in 2, 3, 4 minutes. So in order to test this argument that the way that the sub-federal level is involved in the negotiation process, I use process tracing. So you see here from left to right the implementation process of an international agreement. On the very left, the negotiation, conclusion, entry into force of an Paris Agreement or the international agreement in general. Then in the middle, the implementation process and the negotiations within a federal system. So in particular, the intergovernmental cooperation mechanisms and intergovernmental negotiations between the federal level and the sub-federal level, and at the end, the outcome of this implementation process. And the argument I like to test is that the way the agreement was negotiated, which you see on the left top here, leads or does not lead, depending on the case. But if it was a joint, if the negotiation was handled jointly by the federal level and the sub-federal level, my expectation would be that this leads to a sense of joint ownership across the levels of government, to a feeling of co-responsibility. For instance, in the European Union, I would expect, since both the European member states and the EU Commission and the Council of the EU were present in Paris, the member states feel co-responsible for the Paris commitments, and this has a positive effect on the implementation process. In the Canadian case, I would expect that the fact that the provinces were not involved in the negotiation process in Paris leads to a lack of ownership and a lack of a feeling of co-responsibility at the provincial level, which complicates the implementation process and which hampers the intergovernmental cooperation process in Canada. And at the end, this explains why the European Union has already introduced several measures in order to jointly implement the Paris Agreement, whereas in Canada, besides the carbon tax, we are lacking relevant action, which would be needed for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Then I do process tracing, which is in particular based on the study of documents that were produced in the context of intergovernmental meetings, in particular on interviews, which I'm doing right now. And also I'm looking on debates and speeches by the relevant decision makers to get a feeling of their, kind of argument and their and the discourse they use to defend or to justify their action or non-action. So when we look in the case of the European Union, so we have seen this expected process. The European Commission has launched several proposals to implement the Paris Agreement. There have been several meetings of the European Council and the Council that were dedicated to implementation of the Paris Agreement. And what is now interesting, indeed, when you look at the speeches by several European politicians, for instance, I found a speech by Angela Merkel, in which she clearly states, yeah, we have to be more ambitious in Germany. We have to implement ambitious climate policies in order to contribute to the European target. So there are several instances at the national level in the European Union where national politicians refer to the need to contribute to the European target and to be part of the European climate action plan. And here I would argue that this had led to a motivation at the member state level to negotiate with the other member states and to agree on mechanisms which take into account the very different national interests, and to establish and to create several mechanisms of fairness and solidarity, meaning countries which are able to do more will do more, and other countries of the European Union which are less capable of implementing ambitious climate policies can do less or get help from the other member states. If we look into the Canadian case, well, as mentioned before, Trudeau launched a process of intergovernmental cooperation. He met with the premiers at several instances. Also, the Canadian environmental minister met with his counterpart several times. But in contrast to the European Union, we don't see this commitment, this ownership argument at the provincial level. We've got some provinces, for instance, BC and Quebec, which are fairly motivated or which have more or less or rather ambitious climate targets. But when they refer to their climate policies and when they justify the climate policies, they refer to the international endeavor, to the international goal of limiting climate change. They don't refer to their contribution to Canada's target, to Canada's commitment. They consider themselves independent actors that contribute to the international fight against climate change. But in contrast to the European member states, they don't consider themselves as being part of the national implementation process. And as a consequence, I would argue that that also explains why Trudeau had so hard times to bring everyone on board. And why the provinces that are willing to implement ambitious climate policies are not willing to pay the others out, and the ones that want to pay it out simply withdraw from the process because they don't feel responsible at all regarding the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So to conclude, this is based on very preliminary analysis. As I mentioned before, I'm only doing my Canadian interviews. I'm starting next week only. I will do them in the next 2 months. So this is only based on documents I've studied. But first of all, it seems that the willingness of the federal government and the use of intergovernmental cooperation for the systems does not suffice to explain the development of an implementation plan in federal systems. And secondly, it seems that the involvement of the sub-federal level, in the case of the European Union, the member states, in international negotiations has a positive effect on the implementation process. To conclude generally, which I hope that arguments that I hope that my future research will confirm, multi-level structures matter regarding the implementation of environmental agreements. It makes sense. It's worth including multi-level structures, federalism, decentralization, and intergovernmental cooperation within a federal system in our studies of compliance and treaty implementation. They help us to better understand why some countries do better than others. Multi-level structures are more than just veto points. It depends how they are organized. It's not only about the number of veto players, but also how they cooperate, what mechanisms we do have in a multi-level system. Federalism does not equal federalism. Both the European Union and Canada can be considered having relevant federal features, but still the different ways they are organized produces different outcomes. So we shouldn't use federalism as a dummy variable, but distinguish between different features of federal systems. And federalism is not always bad for implementation. The European Union is not doing that regarding implementation of the Paris Agreement in comparison to Canada, or as I mentioned before, some federal features such as regional accountability also seem to have a positive effect on the implementation of some environmental conventions. I still have a last slide with some ideas for my third paper, but I think I'm just going to leave it here. And thank you very much for your attention. Sorry that I didn't respect the time limit completely. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much in advance for your comments, questions, and other feedback you might have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Johannes. So very pleased to open it up for comments and observations and questions. Anybody wanted from the room too? Jordan, can I ask you to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Johannes. I enjoyed your paper a lot. I'm a history professor and a fellow at the center, so one of your neighbors. And I have no relevant expertise aside from living on the planet, I guess. I guess I found the first paper on the face of things, although you presented them both quickly, I found the first paper more convincing than the second. And I wonder about how you would defend the second. Although and the other thing I wonder about the first paper is there was that grayed out bit on that you skipped past. So you showed us that regional accountability is positively correlated with effective implementation. But then you had grayed out something, autonomy and decentralization, I think. I wonder, I'd be curious to see those and hear you talk about those components. So that's maybe a first question. But the second, in regards to the second paper, I wonder how you would defend. What's compelling about the first paper, I think, is its empirical foundation, where you say, okay, look, across a large number of states, I gather, we can observe the presence of regional accountability, and there's this positive correlation. So the notion that regional accountability, at least, is going to be negatively correlated with implementation is simply false. That seems like a straightforward conclusion from your evidence. The second paper with the two-case comparison to move from your observation to your conclusion, which is about political process, as opposed to say the particular political interests at play in either of the locales, right? That Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, in their particular political conditions, were going to, at least once Alberta had its new election, and that these regional entities were going to opt out, or they would have been obstructionist had they come to Paris, those kinds of things. So that the difference is the political conditions in the EU as opposed to the political conditions in Canada. For example, it just seems that the evidence is more open to any range of interpretations as to why the EU has been more successful and Canada less so. And so it feels more of a stretch to then narrow to this particular dimension of the negotiating process that you want to focus on. So those would be my comments on the two papers. I'm curious about that part of the first paper we didn't hear so much about, and I'd love to hear you defend your kind of way in which you've derived your conclusion in the second paper. And I love that when you got criticized by a bunch of academics at a conference, you launched that into your own paper. I feel like I would have grumbled about that and kind of had my own ideas about it, but I wouldn't have undertaken empirical research. So I think it's wonderful that you have that side paper to say, hey, other people are thinking about this in ways that I am.
Johannes, do you want to respond to this? Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Sorry, I didn't find the microphone. Okay, I'm just going to reshare my screen very quickly with the multivariate regression analysis. Well, in the bivariate analysis, I only looked independently at the three multi-level structures variables, and then in the second analysis, I included all of them and wanted to control variables, and I also took into account possible interaction between these multi-level structures variables. And what seems to be the case is that the positive effect of regional accountability, so cases in which we have regional parliaments, regional governments, this positive effect is mitigated by a high degree of decentralization and by a high level of autonomy, meaning that it seems to be good for implementation to have regional parliaments and regional politicians that are accountable to their electorate, but it seems also to help to have a powerful federal government that kind of oversees what the regions are doing, and which could, in a worst case scenario, interfere in regional decision-making processes.
And Johannes, how much does that mitigating effect of regional autonomy, how much does that bend back toward the arguments of the folks that you're criticizing, who say, isn't that their concern, that regional autonomy, that's the problem for federalism and for federal states in implementing these policies? So, I mean, aren't they going to seize on that part of your results and say, well, this is, sure, they can have local elections as long as they aren't autonomous?
Well, yeah. Well, I think the first argument stands. Multi-level structures seem to matter. It matters how multi-level structure or multi-level system is organized. But yeah, for the second part, you're right. It kind of limits the relevance of my second argument that multi-level structures can also have positive effects. But the positive effect stands, and it's the positive effect of regional accountability. Its significance is still higher than the significance of the mitigating effect of the other two. Mm-hmm. But that's something where I have to have a close look at the particular cases. For instance, Belgium is one case which is doing very well regarding implementation of the wetlands convention, although it has very, very strong regions and regional elections, regional accountability, but at least in theory, the federal government would be able to interfere in that case and not necessarily force the regions to contribute to the implementation of the Wetlands Convention, but find ways to motivate them to do what the federal government wants them to do. Yeah, I think what I have to do here is also to, for instance, take Belgium as a case and look also qualitatively more into the cases and find out how it really works out in practice. This is based on 80 cases, so it's not too many either. But yeah, to some extent it limits the argument that multi-level structures can have a positive effect. But again, at least based on the numbers, the mitigating effect is less significant than the positive effect of regional accountability argument. You know, and the second thing I wanted to highlight here, that's only based on the Ramsar Convention. I still have to add the other 5 conventions into my data set and run the regressions again. And so, and then I will have to see what kind of findings that analysis produces. Yeah, but your point is absolutely fair and justified regarding the limitation of the positive effect. For the second paper, well, the basic idea was first to well, I started with the Canadian case. I had a look at the Canadian case, and then I found these statements by provincial politicians. It's not our responsibility, it's the federal government's responsibility. And that's where I tried to, where I thought, okay, maybe there's more, like that might be a good, there seems to be something that we are overlooking. So why, it's not only about, of course, Alberta has its very strong oil interest. Of course, there was a change of government in Alberta and in Ontario. Doug Ford, of course, as a personality, had an effect on the process in Canada. But the very fact that I found this very regularly, the statements also by BC and Quebec politicians who are rather, like within Canada, the rather climate ambitious governments, even they say, yeah, we're going to have ambitious climate policies, but we're doing it not because we're responsible for the Canadian climate target, but because we want to contribute to the international fight against climate change. And that's when I then thought, okay, what would be another case where we should find a very different dynamic of federalized entities, provinces, states to feel differently about the obligation to contribute. And that's why I came across the European Union case, because there we've got a very different constitution set up. Member states are included, are part of the negotiation. So we should find a completely different discourse regarding their commitment to the European target. I've done some interviews in Europe, and something that has come up frequently is the fact that the European Union has had intergovernmental meetings since 70 years, since the foundation of the European community. And the very fact that the Europeans are used to intergovernmental cooperation, to talk to each other, to know each other's problems, concerns, that helps to just continue like that, to listen to each other and to look for compromises. In Canada, provinces don't seem to be very used to meet regularly with other provinces, with the federal government. You mentioned the actors, the politicians, the change of governments. So there are multiple other explanations why the European Union is doing better than Canada regarding implementation of the Paris Agreement. My aim is not to prove that this ownership argument that is based on the question of how a system is represented at the international level is the sole explanation or a necessary or sufficient condition for the implementation, but it's one of the factors that contribute or that affect the process of implementation. I'm already getting started with my empirical analysis. I've got a list of empirical manifestations, which is based on guidelines of people using process tracing. So I've got my list of empirical manifestations I should find in case that this argument really holds in practice. And yeah, but the limitation, of course, that I really have, well, a challenge is to prove that I'm not only looking for the evidence I want to find in order to prove my argument, but that I also and that I'm not ignoring other factors and other evidence I find, and to put this all together and to hopefully convince my readers that this argument is one of maybe 10, 20 explanations of why Canada is doing worse than other cases regarding the implementation of the Paris Agreement. I'm not sure anymore whether this was more or less the direction in which you want me to go with your question.
Thank you, Johannes. If it's okay, perhaps since we're down to our sort of last 15, 20 minutes, would you mind if I collected maybe a couple of questions?
No, please, perfect.
So that people have their opportunity for observations and comments. Great. We'll start with Dagmar, please, and then Amy, we'll go to you after. Thank you.
Hi, Johannes. I'm not sure if you can hear me well enough because I'm at the back of the room. Okay, excellent. I find with quantitative PhD students, it's best to ask questions about definitions because that's what goes in the calculation. So let me nudge you on some things that you very casually said about your definition of federalism that I think if that's how you conceptualize it, I would encourage you to rethink. You were saying that it's not really federalism if one level can overrule the other. If you look at Canada, that actually is not true. So because there are some provisions where, and that I think is true in other federations, so don't build the should model of what federalism in your head should look like, or don't present it that way. I'm assuming you don't have that in your model, but you might have some ideal version of federalism, but there are federations where that's the case. We can talk about this over lunch, but don't do that. In terms of regional level, if you talk to Canadians about regional level, they will not think of the provinces or the German states as a region. And there again, I also wrote down, you said regional level, they should have policy-making power, they should not just be implemented. So again, in terms of what regions should do, I think really depends on the federation. If it's a province, yes, they will have a certain amount of jurisdiction, but if you're talking about the regional municipality of, I'm from Ontario, so I would say York Region or Halton Region, that's very different than talking about the city of Toronto. And again, constitutionally speaking, and in the EU, that's the same. So again, in terms of what you mean by region and how that plays out then, if there's a different way to conceptualize it to make it clear for different audience which level you actually mean and how you compare that, because you said sub-federal level and there are sometimes many different sub-federal levels. I know you were giving us a lot of insights into your papers, so I don't know how that plays out, but be clear on that also when you present it. Last comment is about what I think where you're actually going. It seems like I find it fascinating that federalism was a dummy variable in many of these models, because that's again to add on to Jordan's point where I think your contribution really is. The last point where you talked about federalism being bad for implementation, you made a small comment where the accountability is actually at the local, at the regional level. So that is something that I think I would encourage you to think about. Maybe that really is also where the movement comes from, because you showed us Greta Thunberg at the beginning, but then that completely and the rational choice model falls off the picture, right? Because I understand this, so I'm not going to argue with that one, but in terms of the contribution, maybe there is something about the local accountability that's not so easily built into the model, but you kept coming back to that in a few of your comments. So maybe that really is also where the contribution of federalism then is, and how that might explain then the different variation that you're interested in. So that's what I heard you talking about and returning back to in a couple of your points. I'll shut up there because I know there's somebody else. Amy has her hand up in the chat, and so I'll let her continue. Looking forward to talking to you more.
Thank you, Dagmar. Amy, can we turn to you? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, thanks, Johannes. This was really interesting. I'm a postdoc at UBC and a visiting fellow at the center right now. Yeah, just a couple questions. One about the first paper, and I think there's multiple potential pathways through which regional accountability matters, right? But you can't get that with this type of method. So I think you had mentioned, or in your slide, QCA as potentially one outlet, which I would encourage you, I think, to follow, understanding in what ways. I think regional accountability matters a lot differently in the EU context, perhaps, than the Canadian context, and implementing different conventions. So it would be interesting to compare potentially across to control for some of those things, and then to try to really find the mechanism for regional accountability and how that matters. A question about the regression is the role of time. I don't know in terms of implementation if that was a control or how that worked. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the role of time in shaping the results there. And then on the second paper, yeah, I think just echoing Jordan's comment and your response to Jordan's comment, I think there is a bigger picture here, the bigger political context, in that the reason why Canada negotiated alone in the Paris Agreement is the symptom of bigger differences in political culture and the relationship between the provinces and the federal government that's very different than in the EU context. So I think there is something there, but framing it perhaps narrowly around the negotiating procedure around the Paris Agreement won't help you maybe get to that. But certainly that's something worth looking at. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, Amy. If there aren't any others who would like to just raise a comment or question, then Johannes, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for the two of you for your questions. I start from the back. Yeah, indeed, my one idea, well, I'm going to conclude the data set and run the regressions, and but as I've either for the first paper or for the last paper, which I'm still figuring out what to do there, to use QCA, because QCA is kind of like a nice combination of really knowing your cases, to know them in qualitative terms, but still do a middle, large, and comparison. So this is really something I'm thinking of doing, but yeah, or still like in the reflection process. Time, I haven't included time, and well, I could try that, but all the data is from, or the newest data is from 2014, so it's 20 years before 2014, so it's kind of before the really the emergence of climate environment protection is a really silent issue. So my feeling would be, yeah, if we're talking about the implementation of agreements after 2015, time really would matter. Before 2014, I'm not sure, but I think it wouldn't be that difficult to include it in the model just to control for it. But my expectation would be that, so we're talking about 20 years before 2014, that it won't have a huge effect. Well, yeah, I know this is kind of an easy excuse, but well, yeah, the second paper, I'm only getting started. I think that I'm going to learn a lot from the interviews I'm going to have the next weeks, and that can also change a lot regarding the paper and its internal framing. And that's also why I think that process tracing is kind of a nice method, because it like doesn't limit you to your hypothesis, to your theoretical argument, but like it allows you very easily to go back and forth between empirics and theoretical ideas. So it allows you to adapt your argument quite easily, or the process you're testing since or at least the way I'm applying it as not as a purely deductive method, but kind of adaptive and like going back and forth between empirics and theory, which also will allow me hopefully to take into account all the other factors you just mentioned, and not like just have like this tunnel perspective and only be looking at this ownership thing. But I got all your points, and I think they're all highly justified, and that give me a lot to think of. So I'm not just, I don't know.
I think we have time to squeeze one more in, if that's okay. Rod, did you have a question or comment? Thank you.
Well, I did have a brief comment. I just wanted to say it's a fascinating topic you're working on, Johannes, and it's one on which I spent a lot of time a long time ago. And I just wanted really to say that I'm very interested in the work you're doing, and I'll get in touch with you. I have a few suggestions about interviews, and if you'd been around a few months ago, I could have given you 6 or 8 boxes of history on implementation of global environmental agreements, but those papers are now pulped, I guess, but I do have a few suggestions about references. There is a stream of literature, just because it might be of interest to others here. Are you aware of the work on two-stage games? Robert Putnam did a paper in '88 on diplomacy and two-stage games, and it has been followed up a little bit with multi-stage games on implementation of environmental work. So it's, but you're familiar with the literature, so not a worry. Okay, we'll talk later.
Thank you, amazing. Thank you very much, Rob. And I didn't want. I think I've ignored the last commentator about definitions, which are, I think is very, very important. Maybe only a brief reaction. I'm not convinced by this term of regions and regional level, but since I'm also talking about entities in non-federal systems, I think like in the federal literature is kind of the term which is used. I don't like it either because regions in every context mean something different. But it's, well, I think it's the basic, well, it's the most common impression that wherever you write it, I have like to clarify it and be clear what I mean by regions. But and it probably applies to also other terms and concepts I used. It's about being more specific about the definitions and the way I use them in my analysis. And very briefly, the social movements, local accountability, I think that's highly interesting and very absolutely worth like looking into my depth. But I think that's something I would have to do in other qualitative paper. For instance, as I mentioned the case of Belgium before, which I find very interesting. It's kind of counterintuitive that Belgium is doing very well regarding implementation of the Wetlands Convention, but there's in other cases where we see that the social movements are not the same in all regions of a system. We have, for instance, in Germany, we've got areas where the Fridays for Future movement is far stronger than other regions. So we should expect that a politician in Baden-Württemberg reacts differently to the Fridays for Future movement than a politician in Saxonia, where the Fridays for Future movement is basically absent. So that, of course, or I assume that this has an effect on the incentives and on the motivations of a regional politician regarding its contribution to climate targets. But yeah, thank you so much, all of you. And definitions, that's something that my supervisor always tells me, and apparently I still have to do some work on that.
And Johannes, thank you so much. And thank you to all for participating, and again to Kayla and Jody for all of their help in making these possible. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you very much.